What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to Ami's house. I wanted to do an emergency solo cast episode as I came across a clip from the recent episode of the Joe Rogan Experience where he is reacting to, as many people are, Kanye West's latest track. And as much as I don't want to have to draw attention to it, the fact of the matter is that it cannot be ignored because so many other millions and millions of people are reacting to it, sharing it, enjoying it, complimenting it. I don't know. But I felt that it needed to be unpacked because I'm noticing a massive blind spot, a massive category error, particularly with people kind of reacting and trying to indulge with this song, seeing how Rogan's kind of torn in how to think about it and how to react to it. And, you know, to those of us in the Jewish community, it seems like the most obvious expression of anti-Semitism. And how should this even be a discussion? How should this even be an issue? Because, I don't know, it seems like with other racial minorities, we don't hold it to that standard, but we can get into that. So it seems obvious to us, but let's go there for a minute. To try to get into the heads of people who don't seem to get this or understand this the way I'm seeing it, the way we're seeing it. There's always a relationship and a balance between art and reality. All kinds of artistic expression, comedy, music, whatever it may be, exist in the context of a certain reality. And depending on what's going on in that reality, kind of can determine where the boundaries are within artistic expression. And I'm not talking about legal boundaries. I'm simply talking about cultural or social boundaries. You know, the day after 9/11, jokes about 9/11 probably wouldn't have gone over well. As we saw at the time, certain comedians tried it and, you know, they were met with backlash, and it was understandable, not because of cancel culture or censorship or overreactions, but because it had just happened. The reality of 9/11 was too close in proximity to be joking about it, and with time and with the reality shifting, you know, that opens up for people to be able to express themselves differently and face different levels of backlash or no backlash at all. And that's always a metric and a gauge comedians are trying to assess. But another example might be that as we make racist jokes or off-color humor, you know, depending on what's going on in actual reality can kind of cue us in as to what's appropriate. So making racist jokes, when we talk about that stuff or joke about it on stage, that would be very different if we were doing it in Jim Crow South, when the reality was that there was actual government discrimination against black people, or the Ku Klux Klan was actually on the rise, or during the time of slavery, to make jokes about slavery or to make jokes about segregation or, you know, make jokes about race and African Americans wouldn't go over well and wouldn't be funny in a society where it's actually going on. So I'm just illustrating that depending on how we process art also depends on what's going on in the reality context that art exists in. Okay, so that's sort of a macro technical understanding of it. And so when you hear people talk about this song, and rather than just condemn it and be decent and say like, ugh, this is gross, all of a sudden in the aftermath of excess woke leftism and cancel culture and a need and thirst to have free speech and have conversations, which I can understand, there's this huge confusion that's happening here. And I'll address them kind of one by one. I do think there's this perception that because Jews are disproportionately successful and therefore powerful, you know, that they're not worth sympathy or, you know, given a certain graciousness or extending sort of that in the same way people are trying to extend it to Kanye to try to understand what he's really saying or what's the best way to react to this. But we didn't assume that with other groups. For example, you know, when Michael Richards went on his rant on stage at the Laugh Factory and started dropping N-words at people, dropping the N-bomb, and he wasn't joking when he did it. He did it with the intent to hurt and cause pain. Nobody then assumed, after he faced massive backlash and ostracization, he was ostracized and canceled, nobody said, wow, black people must have all of this power. They must be controlling everything. Look what they were able to do to Michael Richards. Nobody suspected that or came to that conclusion. And yet, when it comes to Jew hatred, anti-Semitism, there's all the suspicion about Jewish control behind the scenes. And I don't know. It jumps to that conclusion when Kanye faces backlash when he goes off against the Jews. So that's interesting and an interesting double standard. We don't try to understand what Michael Richards was doing and what he was saying or where it was coming from. We didn't extend a sort of graciousness of maybe Michael Richards had a bad experience with black people and that's where it came from. Like, we didn't extend this sort of graciousness and sympathy. We simply said, that's indecent. That's not cool. You're not joking. And there's going to be social consequences for that. And that's just that is what it is. That's what it was. So I see there's this massive flaw and not applying the standards equally there, because perhaps the way Jordan Peterson expressed it, there's nothing more annoying than a successful minority, right? You know, people perceive Jews as successful and therefore powerful and therefore not deserving of sympathy when hate comes their way. If anything, we try to understand the hater more than the group receiving the hate. We try to say maybe they have a point. Maybe it comes from a legitimate grievance, which is kind of sickening because, you know, from our perspective, there were a lot of influential and successful Jews, you know, pre-World War II, in Europe, prominent. That success, that prominence did not save them. And we can get to that. We'll get to that in a little bit. I also think, you know, Joe is trying to say, like, hey, anti-Semitism's not cool. Racism of any kind is not cool. Fine. But should we just let this thing air out? I mean, look at what happened with Tony Hinchcliffe. When he made his joke about Puerto Ricans, there was crazy reactions and stuff, but that it just fizzled out and everything's okay. Okay, a couple things on this. It would be lovely and wonderful to just ignore Kanye West. It would be wonderful to just not react to it and let it fizzle out. Unfortunately, Kanye West has over 30 million followers across social media, which is almost double the amount of Jews that there are in the world. Kanye West has more followers than there are Jews in the world. There's what, like 15, 16 million Jews total? And Kanye West has more reach to his followers and people who like him and adore him than there are Jews at all. And so if a lot of people are going to react to it and respond positively to this messaging, then we have to react to it. We have no choice. To not do so is irresponsible. And so, okay, going back to the Tony Hinchcliffe example. Tony Hinchcliffe was making a joke about Puerto Rico and Puerto Ricans, and it was, in fact, a joke. And so any joke, because its intention is to be funny and to be a joke, I think doesn't warrant outrage and that kind of judgment. And that's fair. And that's why I think that's an overreaction to condemn a comedian trying to tell a joke. However, if Tony Hinchcliffe had spent the last year and a half mouthing off negatively about Puerto Ricans and making explicitly racist comments about Puerto Ricans, not in jest, not as a joke, and on top of that, Puerto Rico had been attacked by a genocidal regime that was met with support all over the world across college campuses that wished to destroy Puerto Rico and any Puerto Ricans around the world that support Puerto Rico. If that was the reality, and then you had Tony Hinchcliffe going around making disparaging comments about Puerto Ricans and meant it, I think we might have processed a joke by him about Puerto Rico a little bit differently. or if he had put a song together that got everyone to sing some of the most offensive things towards Puerto Ricans and got them to celebrate it and enjoy it. Had he meant it, then we wouldn't have taken it as a joke. Or we would have said, Tony doesn't mean this as a joke. He means it. He means to disparage Puerto Ricans. Given his record of disparaging comments over the last year and a half, his expressed hatred and dislike of Puerto Ricans. In other words, an edgy, racy, racist kind of joke. If it's a joke, that means you don't actually mean it. That's the point of comedy. You're just joking. You don't mean it intentionally. But Kanye West, when he expresses anti-Semitism, means it. Now, whether that's rooted in his mental illness mixed with emotional trauma and turmoil and bad experiences he's had with Jews, fair enough. We could talk about where it stems from. But he means it. He's not trying to just create a character or express, art for art's sake. There's a reality that exists and creates a context by which all of this is coming out. And it's coming from a place of trying to cause pain to Jews and raise suspicion about Jews. That's where all of this is coming from. It's not coming from a place of humor, and it's not coming from just a place of, even provocative art. Even look at the movie Passion of the Christ. I saw that movie, and I remember there was a lot of scandal about that. But one of the issues was that people suspected Mel Gibson might have actually felt ill will towards Jews. And when he was pulled over on the side and said Jews are responsible for everything in a drunken tirade, and he had to make amends and apologize for that, fine, whatever it is, that's also what makes Jewish people uncomfortable. It's like, what are the intentions here of this art? Another example would be Django Unchained and the excessive use of the N-word throughout that movie. It caused a lot of controversy, but I think it would have been a lot more disturbing if we found out that Quentin Tarantino was an actual racist in real life. Then we would have been much more suspicious of this movie and its intentions. The reason I don't think it's such an issue is he's obviously trying to paint a reality in the movie of what the culture was like in the movie. But in real life, Quentin Tarantino is not racist or violent and doesn't advocate for any of those things. It all fit in the context of the movie. Do you mean the joke, or do you mean the song, or do you not? And it seems very clear that Tony Hinchcliffe meant it as a joke, and I enjoyed it, and I think a lot of Puerto Ricans did too and didn't care. And there's, of course, an overreaction of people who don't understand what jokes are and what humor is. The same applies to Chappelle when he's talking about the trans community. He was making jokes about it, and therefore I defend that. I defend the ability and attempt at making jokes about things. But the second you go out of jokes and go into statements that are meant to be taken seriously, things that you mean to say, that's a very different thing and deserves a very different reaction and judgment. Now, I get the idea, and I understand the idea of being cautious and mindful not to overreact to things, because then you draw too much attention to it. But we're talking about Kanye West here. Ye, as he likes to be called. We're talking about him and his reach and influence, which is already there. It precedes any reaction and attention we're giving it. And to see a world now kind of enjoying the beat, kind of indulging this, and not being able to just say, oh, you're a piece of shit, Kanye. This is gross. This is disgusting. Like, we know where, like, the Overton window has been moved. And had there never been a Holocaust or history of repeated Jewish suffering, I think what's important to understand is that the history of Jewish oppression and suffering and trauma, the history of anti-Semitism that actually leads to harm against Jewish people, real harm, violence, pogroms, concentration camps, death camps. It starts in the culture. Jordan Peterson has said this on your show, Joe. Things get bad one small step at a time. And this applies on the far left, and it applies going to the right. And it's that spectrum. When you start to see it in the culture, our alarm bells go up, reasonably so, because this is a total repeat of history. Just imagine in pre-war Nazi Germany as it's on the rise. I'm sure there were people at the time that said, listen, this was just an article written about Jews. Listen, so what? Maybe they have to wear IDs, but maybe it's okay to kind of identify who the Jewish people are. What's wrong with an identification? I believe in identification. We should be able to identify each other and know what communities people come from. Okay, so the restaurant got vandalized. I mean, they shouldn't overreact to it. The glass is broken. I mean, that Jewish shopkeeper, I don't know, maybe he was into some shady stuff. And little by little it goes. And so there's a reality context here and a historical context here. And I'm not for overreacting because, yes, it dilutes the term anti-Semitism. It dilutes the case to be made when you really see it. But when you really see it, it's just as much a disservice to not just call it for what it is as it is to overreact when we are manufacturing anti-Semitism where it's not. You asked the question on your show, you're like, where does this end? And I assumed you were going to be talking about, I don't know, where does it end for us? Because I think for the Jewish community and those of us who have Holocaust surviving grandparents and have seen this before and were raised with a caution that I wasn't even that concerned about until post-October 7th, starting to see what's been going on. And as you admitted to on your show when it first was happening, all this outpouring of anti-Semitism and using Israel and the war to sort of be a lever that can be released to talk about these things and express this hatred. Where does this end? Why do we extend that to a concern for Kanye West? Where does it end for him? Because I know where we're asking ourselves the same question. Where does it end? And it seems like with time, it keeps getting darker and darker and darker. And things get more permissive, not for the sake of artistic expression, but allowing people to dehumanize and express some of the most hurtful phrases with regard to the Jewish community. And when you see that, if you just think about the things you can say about Jewish people today that 5 years ago would have just been considered not cool and indecent, not because of cancel culture or woke left madness, but simply because we all should just agree that racism, anti-Semitism, judging people by the color of their skin and collectively judging them is just a shitty thing to do. But when it comes to Jews today, you can get away with a whole lot. So the ultimate question remains, is it true that you can't say anything about Jews? Or is it true that you can say whatever you want about Jews and pretty much get away with it? After all, this new song by Ye is viral and spreading, and people are singing it and enjoying it. Seems like you can get away with it. Seems like you can get away with it. So what does that tell you? There are more followers of Kanye West than there are Jews in the world. And so you can understand, in a post-October 7th world, when we've seen mobs of crowds cheering for the slaughter of Israelis, why we'd be a little bit concerned as these things can start in the culture. I'm a little bit weary and cautious to call these things out and just expect basic decency from everyone else to call it and hold it by the same standard they would call any form of bigotry or racism. So I think, and I'll close by saying this, that for the sake of art and for the sake of comedy, it's good to have a society that preserves decency and tolerance and respect in reality. In a world where we all actually respect each other and we eliminate senseless bigotry and hatred and anti-Semitism, when we minimize those things and call them out, that allows, I think, for the arts and comedy to flourish, because we know now we can live in a world where when we see those things in the forms of jokes or songs or movies, that they're simply artistic expressions or representations, and they don't actually correspond to any sort of real sentiment in reality. But if the opposite happens, and in actual reality, real sentiments of anti-Semitism and hatred and bigotry and racism are allowed to flourish without being properly confronted, that's much worse for the comedic arts, for music, for movies, for film. The whole point of a joke is that you don't mean it. And it's intended to make someone laugh, not to make someone hurt or cause pain. It's supposed to bring us all closer together. Music, art, comedy. It's supposed to bring us all closer together, not drive people further apart, not create suspicion and division that leads to harm and hate. I mean, that seems antithetical to what the arts should be, what music should be, what comedy should be. So, again, I'll just reiterate. If you mean it in reality, then I become very suspicious when it gets expressed artistically. And it seems like with Kanye West, whatever he's doing with his art is something he agrees with in real life. So where does this end? I don't know. But I'm concerned, and I'm hoping that from what I've just said, you and everyone else can understand why.